The tendency to accuse critics of Israel of being anti-Semitic reached new heights, or perhaps a new low, in early 2007, when the American Jewish Committee released a paper by the Indiana University English professor Alvin H. Rosenfeld titled Progressive Jewish Thought and the New Anti-Semitism. Rosenfeld identified a group of liberal American Jews, including playwright Tony Kushner, historian Tony Judt, poet Adrian Rich, and Washington Post columnist Richard Cohen, who have been critical of Israel and charged them with participating alongside a new anti-Semitism that denies Israel's right to exist. In his introduction to the paper, the committee's executive director, David Harris, wrote, "The most surprising and distressing feature of this new trend is the very public participation of some Jews in the verbal onslaught against Zionism and the Jewish state." The targets of Rosenfeld's critique vehemently denied his various charges, and Rabbi Michael Lerner of Tikkun pointed out the consequences of such unwarranted accusations. When we talk to congressional representatives who are liberal or even extremely progressive on every other issue, he wrote, they tell us privately that they are afraid to speak out about the way Israeli policies are destructive to the best interests of the United States or the best interests of world peace, lest they too be labeled anti-Semitic and anti-Israel. If it can happen to Jimmy Carter, some of them told me recently, a man with impeccable moral credentials, then no one is really politically safe. In all of these cases, there was no evidence of actual anti-Semitism. True anti-Semitism conceives of Jews as being different from other people in various invidious ways, which gives those others license to single them out and persecute them in both large and small ways. Anti-Semites maintain that Jews who are engaged in what seem like legitimate political activities, running for office, contributing to political campaigns, writing articles and books, or organizing lobbying groups, are actually engaged in dark and secret conspiracies. Real anti-Semites sometimes favor harsh measures to deny Jews full political rights, and at times advocate even more violent persecution of Jews. Even in its milder forms, anti-Semitism indulges in various forms of stereotyping and implies that Jews should be viewed with suspicion or contempt, while seeking to deny them the ability to participate fully and freely in all realms of society. In its essential features, true anti-Semitism resembles other forms of racist or religious discrimination, all of which have been roundly condemned in Europe and the United States since the end of World War II. By contrast, almost all of the many Gentiles and Jews who now criticize Israeli policy or worry about the lobby's impact on U.S. foreign policy find such views deeply disturbing and categorically reject them. Rather, they believe that Jews are like other human beings, which means that they are capable of both good and bad deeds, and that they are entitled to the same status as other members of society. They also believe that Israel acts like other states, which is to say that it vigorously defends its own interests and sometimes pursues policies that are wise and just, and sometimes does things that are strategically foolish and even immoral. This perspective is the opposite of anti-Semitism. It calls for treating Jews like everyone else and treating Israel as a normal and legitimate country. Israel, in this view, should be praised when it acts well and criticized when it does not. Americans are also entitled to be upset and critical when Israel does things that harm U.S. interests, and Americans who care about Israel should be free to criticize it when its government takes actions that they believe are not in Israel's interest either. There is neither special treatment nor a double standard here. Similarly, most critics of the lobby do not see it as a cabal or conspiracy. Rather, they argue, as we have, that pro-Israel organizations act as other interest groups do. While the charge of anti-Semitism can be an effective smear tactic, it is usually groundless. Indeed, there are signs that the reflexive charge of anti-Semitism is beginning to lose its power to stifle debate. The attacks on Jimmy Carter's book did not deter the former president from publicizing it widely, including a visible and successful appearance at Brandeis University. And a number of other public figures and mainstream publications have recently offered intelligent criticisms of Israeli policy and the lobby's influence. Even William Kristol seems to have recognized that calling critics of Israel or the lobby anti-Semites is losing its capacity to silence others, writing in the Wall Street Journal that the mainstream Jewish organizations have played the anti-Semitism card so often that it has been devalued. The obvious reason is that increasing numbers of people recognize that this serious charge keeps getting leveled at individuals who are not anti-Semites, but who are merely questioning Israeli policies or pointing out that the lobby promotes policies that are not always in the U.S. national interest. Let us be clear. Anti-Semitism is a despicable phenomenon with a long and tragic history, and all people should remain vigilant against its resurgence and condemn it when it arises. Furthermore, we should all be disturbed by the presence of genuine anti-Semitism in parts of the Arab and Islamic world, and in other societies, e.g. Russia, as well as its lingering presence in some segments of American and European society. But it is essential that we distinguish between true anti-Semitism and legitimate criticism of Israeli policy, because blurring them makes it harder to fight true bigotry and makes it more difficult to intelligently discuss U.S. foreign policy. Americans should be free to discuss the activities of groups that are pushing the United States to support Israel generously and unconditionally, in the same way that we examine the political activities of other interest groups without having to worry about being smeared or marginalized. Conclusion. The various strategies that groups in the lobby employ, as discussed in this chapter and the previous one, are mutually reinforcing. If politicians know that it is risky to question Israeli policy or the United States' unyielding support for Israel, then it will be harder for the mainstream media to locate authoritative voices that are willing to disagree with the lobby's views. If public discourse about Israel can be shaped so that most Americans have generally positive impressions of the Jewish state, then politicians will have even more reason to follow the lobby's lead. Playing the anti-Semitism card stifles discussion even more and allows myths about Israel to survive unchallenged. Although other interest groups employ similar strategies in varying form, most of them can only dream of having the political muscle that pro-Israel organizations have amassed. The question, therefore, is what effect does the Israel lobby have on U.S. foreign policy? Is its influence in the American national interest, or has it encouraged policies that are bad for the United States and even for Israel itself? It is to that question that we now turn. Part 2. The Lobby in Action. Introduction to Part 2. The Israel lobby's influence would not be especially worrisome if its agenda were limited to making sure that Congress continued to provide foreign aid for the Jewish state. Although there might be better uses for this money, the United States is a wealthy country and can afford the $3 billion plus that it annually provides to Israel. But the lobby's efforts have not been limited to foreign aid. Like a number of other special interest groups, it also works to influence various aspects of U.S. foreign policy, in its case focusing primarily on the Middle East. These efforts to shape policy in the region are understandable. Although material aid is valuable, it is even more helpful to have the world's only superpower bring its vast capabilities to bear on Israel's behalf. Even so, this aspect of the lobby's agenda would be of little concern if it encouraged policies that were obviously in America's best interest. In the next 5 chapters, we show that this is not the case. The United States has 3 main interests in the Middle East today: keeping Persian Gulf oil flowing to world markets, discouraging the spread of weapons of mass destruction, and reducing anti-American terrorism originating in the region. There are instances where the lobby has supported policies that advanced these interests, but many of the policies that organizations in the lobby have promoted over time have ultimately left the United States worse off. That was not their intention, of course, and the groups and individuals who pushed for these policies undoubtedly believed that the actions they favored would be good for the United States. They were wrong. Indeed, although these policies were intended to benefit Israel, many of them have damaged Israel's interests as well. The lobby's agenda. In addition to preserving U.S. aid to Israel, groups in the lobby have sought to ensure that American power is used to shape the Middle East environment in ways they believed would advance Israel's interests, especially in security. In practical terms, this meant backing Israel in its long struggle with the Palestinians and directing American power against other movements or states that might be at odds with Israel. As noted in Chapter 4, there are differences within the pro-Israel community about the virtues of creating a viable Palestinian state, with the leaders of the lobby tending to be more hostile to that idea than the rank and file. Nevertheless, few supporters of Israel advocate an even-handed policy toward the two sides, and fewer still have called for the United States to pressure Israel to produce a settlement. Most pro-Israel groups, and especially the central organizations in the lobby, also want the United States to help Israel remain the dominant military power in the Middle East. In addition to maintaining generous aid to Israel's military establishment, these groups favor using American power to deal with Israel's main regional adversaries, Iran, Iraq under Saddam, and Syria. At the very least, the lobby wants America to contain these so-called rogue states and to make sure that they do not acquire nuclear weapons. Some of these groups have gone farther, advocating that the United States use its power to topple the regimes in Iran, Iraq, and Syria and replace them with leaders willing to live peacefully with Israel. In the best of all possible worlds, Washington would transform the entire region by spreading democracy and drawing up support for terrorism against both the United States and Israel. Finally, the lobby has pushed American leaders to disarm Hezbollah and help create a Lebanon that is friendly to Israel. But these goals cannot be accomplished without radically changing the behavior of Iran and Syria, since those states support and arm Hezbollah, and Syria has a long history of involvement in Lebanese politics. Given these and other links among Israel's adversaries, the lobby tends to see all of them as part of a seamless web of evil that the United States must at least keep at bay, if not destroy. To deal with these different threats to Israel, key groups within the lobby have encouraged the United States to deploy substantial military forces in the Middle East. As we will show, the lobby played an important role in making the case for war with Iraq, which was the first step in a broader campaign of regional transformation. Even today, many of Israel's most vociferous supporters oppose withdrawing American forces from Iraq and redeploying them outside of the region, because keeping U.S. forces in the neighborhood leaves them well positioned to threaten Israel's adversaries or to take action against them should the need or the opportunity arise. The United States and Israel after 9/11. The lobby made considerable progress pushing its agenda during the 1990s, even though it was more difficult to make the case that Israel was a strategic asset for the United States once the Cold War was over. Then came the attacks of September 11, 2001, which forced Americans to focus considerable attention on the Arab and Islamic world, and especially the Middle East. This was a critical moment for Israel and the lobby. Would the Bush administration conclude that close ties between the United States and Israel were fueling anti-American terrorism? And would it therefore try to improve its image in the Arab and Islamic world by distancing itself, even if only slightly, from Israel? Specifically, would President Bush put pressure on the Sharon government to end its efforts to colonize the West Bank and instead create a viable Palestinian state? Might the United States also begin to reduce its military presence in the wider Middle East, which had grown considerably since 1990 and which had worked to Israel's advantage? These were not idle fears. As we describe in Chapter 2, there was compelling evidence showing that Osama bin Laden was committed to the Palestinian cause and was angry at the United States for backing Israel so strongly. It was also clear that he deeply resented the presence of American troops on Arab soil, especially in Saudi Arabia, and that the combination of these two policies was fueling Arab and Islamic anger at the United States and facilitating al-Qaeda's efforts. Might the United States respond to this situation by returning to its earlier position as an offshore balancer in the Middle East and pressing more vigorously for an end to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict? There were precedents for precisely this sort of response. The Reagan administration had briefly deployed U.S. troops in Lebanon in the early 1980s, but had removed them after a suicide bomber killed 241 Marines in Beirut. Presidents Jimmy Carter and George H.W. Bush had also made genuine progress toward peace in the region, but only by putting pressure on Israel and by paying less attention to the lobby. Yet, despite these concerns, the post-September 11 focus on Middle East threats was also an opportunity for Israel and its American advocates. If the Bush administration could be convinced that Israel was a critical ally in the war on terror, and that Israel's enemies were America's enemies as well, then perhaps the United States could be induced to back Sharon's hardline approach toward the Palestinians, and to take aim at Israel's regional adversaries, Hezbollah, Iran, Iraq, and Syria. In essence, American policymakers had to be shown that it made good strategic sense for the United States to try to rid the Middle East of Israel's foes, which were also said to be America's foes. As one would expect, Israel and key groups in the lobby began working together to turn this opportunity into a reality. Their efforts succeeded. The Bush administration eventually embraced the lobby's views about the new threat environment and rejected the alternative paradigm. Not only did the United States gradually adopt Israel's policy preferences toward the Palestinians, Iran, and the rest of the region, It also adopted many of Israel's justifications for these policies. American and Israeli leaders began to sound as if they were speaking from the same page. The conventional wisdom is that this outcome was overdetermined. In this version of events, Bush and Sharon, and now Ehud Olmert, saw the world in essentially the same way. The president and his advisers needed little encouragement from the lobby because they had accepted Israel's views on how to deal with the Arab Islamic world from the very beginning, and even more so after 9/11. This interpretation of how U.S. Middle East policy evolved after 9/11 is not accurate because it overlooks the very real disagreements that occasionally emerged between the Bush administration and the Israeli government. In the first year after September 11, Bush and Sharon clashed on a number of occasions over the Palestinian issue. Even after those disputes were resolved, there were still important differences between them regarding the Palestinians. In fact, Bush's efforts to deal with the Israeli-Palestinian conflict sometimes reflected the alternative paradigm, which called for greater effort to promote Israeli-Palestinian peace and diffuse Arab hostility. This view enjoyed considerable support within the State Department and the U.S. intelligence community, as well as among the uniformed military. Bush also had important differences with Israel and the lobby over U.S. policy toward Syria. On both the Palestinian and Syrian issues, however, the lobby successfully pressured Bush to change course and to adopt its policy preferences instead. Furthermore, the lobby played a critical role in shaping U.S. policy toward Iraq and Iran, as well as the Bush administration's grand scheme for transforming the Middle East into a sea of democracies. And the lobby worked overtime to convince Americans that Israel was in the right during its war in Lebanon in the summer of 2006, and to ensure that politicians from both parties supported Israel unreservedly. These are controversial claims and should not be made lightly. Both before and during the war in Iraq, a number of public figures suggested that President Bush's Middle East policy, especially his decision to invade Iraq, was at least partly intended to benefit Israel. Not surprisingly, both Israelis and prominent pro-Israel Americans challenged this view, in some cases invoking the familiar charge that such individuals were anti-Semites. But controversial or not, the issue here is a factual one. Did the lobby exert a significant influence on U.S. Middle East policy? And if so, were the results beneficial for the United States or for Israel? The answer to the first question is clearly yes, and we believe the answer to the second question is emphatically no. Let us look more closely at the Bush administration's policies in the Middle East, starting with its support for Israel's policies in the occupied territories, followed by an examination of its decision to invade Iraq. We will then consider Washington's broader policy of regional transformation, paying special attention to its policy toward Syria and Iran. Finally, we will examine America's handling of the 2006 Lebanon War. We argue that in each case, U.S. policy would have been different if the lobby were not as powerful or if the main groups within it had favored a different approach. America's actions would also have been more in line with its national interest and better for Israel as well. Chapter 7. The Lobby versus the Palestinians. It is now largely forgotten, but in the fall of 2001 and again in the spring of 2002, the Bush administration sought to reduce anti-American sentiment in the Arab and Islamic world by pressing Israel to halt its expansionist policies in the occupied territories, and by advocating the creation of a Palestinian state. Following the September 11 attacks, American policymakers believed that shutting down the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, or at least making a serious attempt to do so, would undermine support for terrorist groups like al-Qaeda and facilitate the building of an international coalition against terrorism, which might even include states like Iran and Syria. Yet the Bush administration was unable to persuade Jerusalem to change its policies, and Washington instead ended up backing Israel's hardline approach toward the Palestinians. Over time, Bush and his lieutenants also adopted Israel's justifications for this approach, and U.S. and Israeli rhetoric became similar. A Washington Post headline in February 2003 summarized the situation. Bush and Sharon nearly identical on Mideast policy. The lobby's influence was one of the central reasons for this shift. The story begins in late September 2001. President Bush began pushing Israeli Prime Minister Ariel Sharon to show restraint in the occupied territories and to do everything possible to contain the violence of the Second Intifada. The administration put what the New York Times described as enormous pressure on Sharon to allow Israeli Foreign Minister Shimon Peres to meet with Palestinian leader Yasser Arafat, even though Bush was highly critical of Arafat's leadership. In early October, the new American president said publicly for the first time that he supported a Palestinian state. This event was itself a surprising development, since even President Clinton, who had worked assiduously for a two-state solution, did not dare utter the words Palestinian state in public until his last month in office. Bush had emphasized before 9/11 that he intended to take a hands-off approach toward the Arab-Israeli conflict, which makes his sudden interest in this issue especially revealing. Israeli leaders were alarmed by these developments, fearing that Washington might sell out the Jewish state to win favor with the Arabs. The Washington Post reported that sources close to Sharon say he is furious at U.S. attempts to enlist Iran, Syria, and other states that have sponsored attacks on Israel into the U.S.-led coalition. In early October, Sharon erupted, accusing Bush of trying to appease the Arabs at our expense. Israel, he warned, will not be Czechoslovakia. Hours after making these comments, the Israel Defense Forces invaded several Palestinian areas in Hebron. Bush was reportedly angry at Sharon's likening his actions to Neville Chamberlain's capitulation at Munich, and White House Press Secretary Ari Fleischer called Sharon's remarks unacceptable. The Israeli Prime Minister offered a pro forma apology, but the basic problem remained unresolved. Later in October, following the assassination of Israeli Minister of Tourism Rehavam Ze'evi by a renegade Palestinian splinter group, the IDF launched another large-scale incursion into Palestinian-controlled territory in the West Bank. Bush met personally with Israeli Foreign Minister Shimon Peres and demanded a quick withdrawal, saying that he hoped the Israelis would move their troops as quickly as possible. The Israeli government rejected that demand and said it would leave when it was satisfied that Arafat had cracked down on Palestinian terrorists. The Guardian wrote that Ariel Sharon had provoked the most bruising confrontation with Washington since George Bush came to power, flatly rejecting a demand to end an occupation of Palestinian lands that threatens the survival of Yasser Arafat. Sharon and the pro-Israel lobby moved quickly to resolve this growing dispute by convincing the Bush administration and the American people that the United States and Israel faced a common threat from terrorism. Israeli officials and key groups in the lobby would repeatedly emphasize over the next few years that there was no real difference between Arafat and Osama bin Laden, and that therefore the United States and Israel should isolate the Palestinians' elected leader and not politically engage with him. As Sharon told his self-described longtime supporter, columnist William Safire of the New York Times, in December 2001, "You in America are in a war against terror. We in Israel are in a war against terror. It's the same war." Sharon's concerns about U.S. Middle East policy actually began immediately after 9/11, several weeks before Bush first expressed his support for a Palestinian state. He had a telephone conversation with American Jewish leaders on September 14, in which he made it clear that he was worried that the Bush administration would treat Arafat differently from bin Laden, and that Bush would try to be tough on Israel as a way of winning Arab support for the war on terrorism. Sharon asked those leaders for their help. But little happened in the wake of that conversation, in part because almost everyone in the United States was still reeling from the events of 9/11, but also because it was not clear at that point where American policy was headed. In that uncertain moment, the Project for the New American Century released an open letter to Bush on September 20, signed by many neoconservatives, including William J. Bennett, Eliot Cohen, Aaron Friedman, Reuel Mark Jurek, Robert Kagan, Charles Krauthammer, Jean Kirkpatrick, William Kristol, Richard Pearl, and Norman Podhoretz. The letter described Israel as America's staunchest ally against international terrorism and called for the president to fully support our fellow democracy. It also recommended that the United States cut off all support for the Palestinian Authority. The broad outlines of Bush's policy to defeat terrorism became much clearer after he backed a two-state solution, and neither Sharon nor the lobby was happy with the new agenda. The American Israel Public Affairs Committee immediately responded to Bush's comments about a Palestinian state by issuing a statement declaring that the advisers who were pushing this idea on Bush were undermining America's war against terrorism. They are encouraging the president to reward rather than punish those that harbor and support terrorism. At the same time, Mortimer Zuckerman, the chairman of the Conference of Presidents of Major American Jewish Organizations, said that Bush was pursuing a very short-sighted and erroneous policy. Pro-Israel forces began repeating this basic message at every opportunity. Influential figures in the lobby began to put pressure on the Bush administration to allow the IDF to remain in the Palestinian areas it had recently reoccupied for as long as Sharon saw fit. Abraham Foxman, the head of the Anti-Defamation League, wrote a letter to Secretary of State Colin Powell on October 23, in which he said that he was extremely troubled by the State Department's demand that Israel withdraw its forces from the recently seized areas. "We consider such comments to be inappropriate," he wrote, "and contrary to the long-standing American policy that Israel has the right to defend itself. The world is uniting to fight terrorism, and unfortunately, the Palestinian Authority has refused to take steps to stem violence and terrorism." Zuckerman echoed this view, saying Bush's effort to press Israel was inappropriate, intemperate, and defies logic in the face of U.S. efforts in the war on terrorism. The lobby also worked the halls of Congress. On November 16, 89 senators sent Bush a letter praising him for refusing to meet with Arafat until the Palestinian leader took the necessary steps to end the violence against Israel. They also demanded that the United States not restrain Israel from retaliating against the Palestinians and insisted that the administration state publicly that it stood steadfastly behind Israel. According to the New York Times, the letter stemmed from a meeting 2 weeks ago between leaders of the American Jewish community and key senators, adding that Aipac was particularly active in providing advice on the letter. By late November, relations between Jerusalem and Washington had improved considerably. This was due in part to the lobby's efforts, but also to America's initial victory in Afghanistan, which reduced the perceived need for Arab support in dealing with al-Qaeda. Sharon visited the White House in early December and had a friendly meeting with Bush. In fact, just before the meeting began, the IDF attacked targets in Gaza in response to 3 suicide bombings in Israel. Bush neither criticized the Israelis nor asked them for restraint in the future. The White House spokesman emphasized instead that Israel is a sovereign government and that it has a right to live in security. At the same time, Bush demanded that Arafat do more to stop terrorism against Israel. Sharon visited the White House again in February 2002 and had another amicable visit with Bush. The Israeli Prime Minister reiterated the accusation that Arafat was supporting terrorism and identified him as the principal obstacle to settling the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Bush was now clearly receptive to this line of argument. He believed reports that Arafat was behind the controversial Karine A incident that had occurred a month earlier, in January 2002. The Karine A was a freighter loaded with 50 tons of weapons and explosives that was apparently sailing from Iran when it was captured by the Israeli Navy in the Red Sea. Its final destination appeared to be Gaza, although the evidence at the time was not clear. In fact, some argued that the arms were bound for Hezbollah in Lebanon. While there was no definitive evidence that directly implicated Arafat, the Israeli government and the lobby worked hard to make the case that Arafat had procured the weapons and explosives to abet his terrorism campaign against Israel. The Palestinian leader denied responsibility for the Karine A, and Secretary of State Colin Powell and others said that they had not seen evidence that contradicted Arafat's claim of innocence. In the end, however, Bush agreed with Israel and its supporters. With Sharon at his side at the White House, Bush said, "Mr. Arafat has heard from us. I can't be any more clear. He must do everything in his power to fight terror. Obviously, we were at first surprised, and then extremely disappointed when the Karine A showed up loaded with weapons that could have only been intended for one thing, which was to terrorize." The lobby humiliates Bush. Although the American and Israeli positions were now converging, trouble between the two states erupted again in late March 2002, when a Hamas suicide bomber killed 30 Israelis at a Passover Seder. The Palestinian Authority immediately denounced the attack and pledged to prosecute those responsible. But its dismal record of punishing militants left the Israelis cold. They had had enough. Sharon launched Operation Defensive Shield, in which the IDF resumed control of virtually all of the major Palestinian areas on the West Bank. Bush knew right away that Israel's action would damage America's image in the Arab and Islamic world and undermine the war on terrorism. So he demanded on April 4 that Sharon halt the incursions and begin withdrawal. He underscored this message 2 days later, saying this meant withdrawal without delay. On April 7, Bush's national security advisor, Condoleezza Rice, told reporters that without delay means without delay. It means now. That same day, Secretary of State Powell set out for the Middle East to pressure all sides to stop fighting and start negotiating. The administration soon came under fire to adopt a different approach. A key target was Powell, who was not only considered unsympathetic, if not hostile to Israel, but was also planning to meet with Arafat during his Middle East trip. The Secretary of State immediately began feeling the heat from staunch supporters of Israel in the Vice President's office and the Pentagon, who pushed Bush and Rice to abandon the effort to restrain Israel. Rice was constantly on the phone to Powell, sometimes sounding like she was giving him a dressing down. He believed that her concerns reflected the views of somebody in the White House. Neoconservatives in the media piled on Powell as well. Robert Kagan and William Kristol wrote in the Weekly Standard on April 11 that Powell had virtually obliterated the distinction between terrorists and those fighting terrorists. The following day, David Brooks, then working for the Weekly Standard, described Powell's trip on the NewsHour with Jim Lehrer as a disaster as opposed to an unmitigated disaster. He went on to say that Powell hurt U.S. prestige, shredded U.S. policy in the Middle East, and most importantly, he hurt our moral clarity. Former Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, who was making Israel's case in the United States at the time, said even before Powell arrived in Israel that his trip won't amount to anything. He was right. The balance of power inside the administration shifted against Powell so quickly and completely that his deputy in Washington called the secretary in Israel and told him, "I'm holding back the fucking gates here. They're eating cheese on you." Powell later said that his trip to the Middle East was 10 of the most miserable days imaginable. Powell got the message, as reflected in his behavior at a joint press conference he held with Ariel Sharon before leaving Israel. The Secretary of State's language, body and verbal, John Simpson of the Sunday Telegraph wrote, "Certainly were not that of the paymaster coming to call a client to account. Far from it. Mr. Powell seemed ingratiating, deferential. No doubt he realizes how much support Mr. Sharon has back in Washington, and how much influence his friends have there with the president." Netanyahu's prediction proved correct. Powell's trip did not amount to anything. A second target was Bush himself, who was being pressed by Jewish leaders and Christian evangelicals. Tom DeLay and Dick Armey were especially outspoken about the need to support Israel, and DeLay and Senate Minority Leader Trent Lott visited the White House on April 10 and personally warned Bush to back off. On the following day, according to Time magazine, a group of evangelical leaders led by the Reverend Jerry Falwell and former presidential candidate Gary Bauer sent Bush a letter demanding that the administration end pressure on Sharon to withdraw from the West Bank. After Falwell adjured his followers to do the same, the White House was flooded with calls and emails. The next day, sources say, senior presidential aides phoned Falwell to reassure him that Bush stood behind Sharon. The first external sign that Bush was caving came that same day, April 11, only 1 week after he insisted that Sharon withdraw his forces, when Ari Fleischer said the president believed that Sharon was a man of peace. Bush publicly repeated this statement on April 18 on Powell's return from his abortive mission, and the president also told reporters that Sharon had responded satisfactorily to his call for a full and immediate withdrawal. Sharon had done no such thing, but Bush was no longer willing to make an issue of it. Israel announced the formal end of defensive shield on April 21, but IDF forces remained in many Palestinian areas, and significant elements of the Israeli control regime are still in force today. Other groups in the lobby kept up the pressure. The Conference of Presidents and the United Jewish Communities sponsored a major rally in Washington in mid-April, with appearances by Army, Netanyahu, Zuckerman, House Minority Leader Richard Gephardt, and other prominent officials. The crowd even booed Deputy Secretary of Defense Paul Wolfowitz, shouting "Down with Arafat," when he briefly referred to Palestinian suffering and the possibility of a Palestinian state. Morton Klein, the head of the Zionist Organization of America, said that if Bush doesn't get the message to stop pressuring Israel, we will have lost a great opportunity with this rally. Responding to the gathering, an unnamed administration official remarked that policy is not based on what's popular. But the same official also admitted that we hear so much from Jewish leaders. To see that many Jews turn out for this rally will just speak volumes. Meanwhile, Congress was also moving to back Sharon. Netanyahu visited Capitol Hill in mid-April, where he met 40 senators, accompanied by a security cordon fit for a head of state. On May 2, it overrode the administration's objections and passed 2 resolutions reaffirming support for Israel. The Senate vote was 94-2. The House version passed 352-21. Both resolutions emphasized that the United States stands in solidarity with Israel and that the two countries are, to quote the House resolution, now engaged in a common struggle against terrorism. The House version also condemned the ongoing support of terror by Yasser Arafat, who was portrayed as a central element of the terrorism problem. A few days later, a bipartisan congressional delegation on a fact-finding mission in Israel publicly proclaimed that Sharon, who was then in Washington meeting with Bush, should resist the administration's pressure to negotiate with Arafat. Then, on May 9, a House Appropriations Subcommittee met to consider giving Israel an extra $200 million to fight terrorism. The White House was opposed to the package, and Secretary of State Powell took the lead and met with congressional leaders in an attempt to stop it. But the lobby backed it, just as it had helped author the 2 congressional resolutions. Powell lost, and Bush reluctantly signed the legislation, giving Israel the money. Sharon and the lobby had taken on the President of the United States and his Secretary of State and triumphed. Hemi Shalev, a journalist for the Israel newspaper Ma'ariv, reported that Sharon's aides could not hide their satisfaction in view of Powell's failure. Sharon saw the white in President Bush's eyes, they bragged, and the president blinked first. Indeed, Bush's humiliation was not lost on commentators around the world. Spain's leading daily, El País, expressed the views of many outside observers when it commented, "If a country's weight is measured by its degree of influence on events, the superpower is not the USA, but Israel." But it was pro-Israel forces in the United States, not Sharon or Israel, that played the key role in thwarting Bush's efforts to pursue a more even-handed policy. The more things change. Despite these setbacks, Bush continued looking for a way to end the Second Intifada and create a viable Palestinian state living in peace next door to Israel. He understood that it is in America's national interest to settle the Arab-Israeli conflict as soon as possible. Bush has not come close to achieving that goal, however, mainly because there has been little change in the balance of power between Bush and the lobby since the spring of 2002. This situation has given Israeli leaders considerable leverage over Bush's Middle East policies and enables them to ignore or neutralize policies they dislike. Seeking to move beyond his troubles in the spring of 2002, Bush gave a major speech on the Middle East on June 24. It was a noteworthy address for two reasons. First, Bush maintained that Arafat had to give up power before the peace process could move forward. Peace, he said, requires a new and different political Palestinian leadership. In effect, as David Landau pointed out in Haaretz, Yasser Arafat, the seemingly immortal leader of the Palestinian national movement, was politically assassinated by President George W. Bush. The Israelis, who had been calling for Arafat's isolation for months, were ecstatic. In fact, at least two prominent conservative Israelis, Natan Sharansky and Benjamin Netanyahu, claimed that they had played a major role in convincing Bush to insert that demand in his speech. Haaretz ran a story on the speech with the headline, "Analysis: Ariel Sharon agrees to his own ideas." Second, Bush called for creating a Palestinian state by 2005. In pursuit of that goal, he emphasized that Israeli settlement activity in the occupied territories must stop, and, as the security situation improved, Israel forces need to withdraw fully to positions they held prior to September 28, 2000, the start of the Second Intifada. Bush was widely criticized for not saying more about what the final settlement would look like and how he planned to get from here to there. While the speech was certainly vague about the particulars of a future agreement, Bush's comments were nevertheless important. At the time, the Bush administration was working closely with the European Union, Russia, and the UN to fashion a roadmap leading to a negotiated peace between Israel and the Palestinians. The plan of the so-called quartet was specifically designed to build on the main points laid out in Bush's speech. In essence, the Bush administration decided in the summer of 2002 that the roadmap was the best way to resolve the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. But little progress was made in implementing it until the spring of 2003. The delay was due to the fact that it took time to convince Arafat to step aside and for the quartet to work out the details of the roadmap. Furthermore, the Bush administration was busy preparing for war with Iraq, which it invaded on March 19, 2003. Serious movement on the roadmap finally began on March 7, when Arafat signaled that he was reducing his own political power by nominating Mahmoud Abbas to be the Prime Minister of the Palestinian Authority. A week later, on March 14, Bush proclaimed that he was ready to promote the roadmap. On April 30, the quartet released the details of that peace plan. Then, in early June, the president traveled to the Middle East to push the roadmap and try to strengthen Abbas's hand vis-à-vis Arafat. Bush's prestige was sky-high in the wake of the successful ouster of Saddam. His triumphant, mission-accomplished photo op on the USS Abraham Lincoln had occurred the previous month. The problems of post-war reconstruction in Iraq were barely apparent, and Bush's popularity at home was at near-record levels. He was in an ideal position to press all sides to get serious about peace. He met first with Arab leaders in Egypt on June 3, and then the following day with Abbas and Sharon in Aqaba, Jordan. Before the trip, reporters were skeptical about whether Bush could put pressure on Israel to achieve his goals, especially with his re-election campaign looming in 2004. "Of course I can," he told them. "Listen, if I were afraid of making the decisions necessary for political reasons, to move the process forward, I wouldn't be going. The meetings were cordial, and Bush's efforts to get directly involved in the peace process appeared to be off to a good start. But the roadmap went nowhere. Despite occasionally paying lip service to the quartet's plan, Sharon was opposed to creating a viable Palestinian state, and thus he had no interest in negotiating with the Palestinians, since the aim of such negotiations was to create just such a state in the occupied territories. His opposition to the roadmap was clear well before March 2003. The Washington Post opined in an editorial on December 16, 2002, that although Sharon has been telling voters about his readiness to support the Bush scheme, the fact is that his envoys have been harshly criticizing the draft roadmap in meetings with U.S. officials. According to Israeli press reports, Mr. Sharon himself dismissed the administration's plan as irrelevant in a recent cabinet meeting. Sharon did not say much publicly in mid-March 2003, when Bush announced that he was pushing the roadmap forward, mainly because he did not want to criticize Bush when the United States was getting ready to invade Iraq. Nevertheless, Sharon's views on the plan had not changed, as Hemi Shalev made clear in an article in the foreword. The strategic goal of Sharon and his advisers is ultimately to undermine the roadmap and to exclude the three remaining members, the EU, UN, and Russia, of the so-called Madrid Quartet, from active involvement in the peace process. In mid-April, Haaretz declared in an editorial that Sharon has not internalized the conceptual change necessary to achieve a peace arrangement based on compromise. Apparently, the Prime Minister has yet to give up the vision of the settlements and the creeping annexation of the West Bank. Given Sharon's opposition to the roadmap, it is hardly surprising that the heads of the key organizations in the lobby viewed Bush's plan as the roadmap to nowhere, to quote Conference of Presidents Chairman Zuckerman. Within hours after Bush said on March 14 that he was getting behind the roadmap, National Security Advisor Condoleezza Rice met at the White House with a delegation of Jewish leaders. The aim of the meeting, according to an article in Haaretz, was to neutralize American Jewish reservations about the plan. But according to the same article, Rice was unable to allay the concerns of many of the participants at the meeting. Abraham Foxman, the head of the ADL, and Malcolm Hoenlein, the executive vice chairman of the Conference of Presidents, were especially critical. Although Hoenlein said it was necessary to wait for Israel's reaction to the plan, he emphasized that the American Jewish community would support Israel if it expressed reservations. Aipac also sponsored a letter to President Bush on Capitol Hill, urging him not to put pressure on Israel regarding the roadmap and demanding that the Palestinians be required to comply fully with the plan's security requirements before Israel had to make any concessions. By early May, 85 senators and 283 representatives had signed the letter. While Aipac ultimately endorsed the roadmap with qualifications, it did not campaign to win its support in Congress, which effectively left the lobbying front open to groups that openly opposed the plan. Many pro-Israel commentators lambasted the administration's decision to push the roadmap forward. For example, Charles Krauthammer, writing in the Washington Post, maintained that proceeding along the roadmap, as long as Arafat retained any power, was diplomatic suicide. Thomas Friedman of the New York Times, however, was critical of the major Jewish organizations for not supporting the peace plan. Apart from more dovish groups such as the Tikkun Community and the Israel Policy Forum, there were few pro-Israel groups enthusiastically backing the roadmap. That meant it had no future. Consequently, Israeli hardliners were not worried much about the roadmap when its details were spelled out on April 30. In an article in Haaretz the following day, Bradley Burston asked, "So why are these people smiling?" The answer is that the Bush administration had privately reached a series of understandings with Sharon and his lieutenants that greatly allayed their fears about the quartet's peace plan. In fact, the Financial Times reported that Elliot Abrams and Stephen Hadley, two key players on the National Security Council, secretly assured Sharon that he would not face U.S. pressure over the roadmap. Still, Sharon must have been worried after Bush's trip to the Middle East in early June 2003, which was widely seen as an important step in promoting the president's peace effort. Shortly after the president returned to the United States, Israel tried but failed to kill Abdel Aziz Rantizi, a key Hamas leader. It was the first of 7 targeted assassinations in 5 days. Sharon had promised Secretary of State Powell in May that Israel would stop targeted assassinations unless they involved a ticking bomb, which was clearly not the case in this instance. Indeed, Hamas had announced the day before the attack that it was willing to renew talks about a ceasefire. Moreover, the Forward reported that at the Aqaba summit meeting, Sharon had agreed to avoid actions that might inflame the situation and weaken the rookie Palestinian prime minister. Israeli commentators understood that the Israeli prime minister was now attempting to sink the roadmap. The curious timing of the assassination campaign, a Haaretz correspondent wrote, was not lost on Israelis. Bush was not pleased, yet he only mildly rebuked Sharon, saying on June 10, "I am troubled by the recent Israeli helicopter gunship attacks." His aide's remarks, according to the Washington Post, were only slightly stronger. But even the slightest criticism of Israel was unacceptable to the hardliners in the lobby, who soon mobilized to check Bush's brief show of independence. DeLay had a private meeting with the president's aides and told them that he would push forward a congressional resolution supporting Israel if Bush continued to criticize it. On the evening of June 11, Bush hosted a dinner at the White House with 100 Jewish leaders to celebrate a new exhibit at the Holocaust Memorial Museum. Malcolm Hoenlein, who met privately with Bush that evening, said that the president and others at the White House recognized that their reaction could be counterproductive. Hoenlein went on to say that people were taken a little aback by the comments and, from what everyone could tell, the White House was well aware of it. By the next day, June 12, the White House had done another U-turn and was firmly supporting Israel. The Washington Post reported that, in coordinated statements, White House and State Department officials tried to shift the diplomatic focus from Israeli actions to the commitments made by Arab leaders at a summit last week in Egypt to cut off funding and support for terrorist attacks against Israelis. Secretary of State Colin Powell made that point in a round of phone calls to Arab foreign ministers. Ari Fleischer, the White House press secretary, said, "The issue is not Israel. It is terrorists who are killing in an attempt to stop a hopeful process from moving forward." Later that month, the House passed a resolution by a vote of 399 to 5, expressing solidarity with the Israeli people and saying that Israel was fully justified in using force to deal with terrorism. Bush had once again tried to curb Israeli actions that strengthened anti-Americanism in the Arab and Islamic world and undermined the administration's war on terrorism. But he ended up suffering another humiliating defeat. Unilateralism in, roadmap out. Much the same pattern was evident in late July 2003 when the Bush administration began to voice its objections to Israel's so-called security fence, which was widely seen as an Israeli attempt to create facts on the ground that would be a major obstacle to a negotiated settlement. The issue was not construction of the fence itself, but rather its intended route, which in effect would incorporate additional parts of the occupied territories and impose significant additional hardships on thousands of Palestinians. Bush expressed his displeasure at a joint White House press conference with Palestinian Prime Minister Mahmoud Abbas on July 25. "I think the wall is a problem, and I discussed this with Ariel Sharon. It is very difficult to develop confidence between the Palestinians and Israel with a wall snaking through the West Bank." But 4 days later at the White House, with Bush standing at his side, Sharon made it clear that he intended to continue building the fence, although he said he would try to minimize the hardships it inflicted on the Palestinians. Bush did not challenge Sharon, but instead accepted the Prime Minister's view that Palestinian terrorism was the fundamental obstacle to peace. Nevertheless, the Bush administration continued to express its unhappiness with the security barrier. Secretary of State Powell suggested in an interview that the fence was an Israeli attempt to appropriate Palestinian land, and Condoleezza Rice hinted that the administration might deduct the cost of the fence from $9 billion in loan guarantees that the United States had approved in April. Israel supporters in Congress mobilized and emphasized to the White House, as Senator Charles Schumer put it, that if the president flouts the will of Congress and tries to penalize Israel for defending itself, Congress will do everything in its power to ensure that these loan guarantees are not held up. The Israelis themselves were not seriously concerned. As one senior Israeli official put it, "We are not under any pressure. The United States is a very vibrant democracy, and this is a very politically oriented administration. Reality is made sometimes by political constraints." The issue of loan guarantees would not go away, however, and in late November, the Bush administration said that it would cut $289.5 million from the $3 billion in loan guarantees allocated to Israel earlier that year. The lobby did not protest strongly, mainly because the punishment was effectively a weak slap on the wrist. The United States was not cutting direct foreign aid, the real meat and potatoes of its material support to Israel. Reducing the loan guarantees by roughly 10% simply meant that Israel had to pay a higher interest rate on a small portion of the overall amount it intended to borrow. The former Director General of Israel's Finance Ministry estimated that it would cost Israel about $4 million a year in higher interest costs, which is not a lot of money for a prosperous state like Israel. The Bush administration won another small victory in the fall of 2003. Sharon was threatening to expel Arafat from the West Bank and send him into exile. Powell and Rice told the Israelis that expelling the Palestinian leader was unacceptable to the United States. They got the message, and Arafat remained in the West Bank. But these small victories were not indications of a changing tide. On the contrary, in the fall of 2003, Sharon began moving to wreck George Bush's roadmap once and for all by pushing forward his own plan for unilateral disengagement. In November, Sharon invited Elliott Abrams, the senior director for Near East and North African Affairs on the National Security Council, NSC, and a well-known neoconservative, to a secret meeting in Rome. At the meeting, Sharon informed the American official that instead of pursuing a negotiated settlement, as called for in the roadmap, he intended to impose his own settlement on the Palestinians. As the policy evolved in the next few months, it became clear that Israel would first withdraw all of its settlements from Gaza and turn that territory over to the Palestinians. Israel would then turn some areas of the West Bank over to the Palestinians, but keep large parts of that contested land for Israel. Sharon's decision to leave these parts of the occupied territories to the Palestinians was based not on sympathy for their plight, but on the fear that if Israel retained Gaza and all of the West Bank, Arabs would soon outnumber Jews in Greater Israel. The demographic issue, in other words, was driving the Prime Minister's policy. The Palestinians would have virtually no say in the process. Israel would dictate the terms of the settlement, and in the end, the Palestinians would not get a state of their own. Dov Weissglass, Sharon's closest advisor, made this clear when he said that the significance of what we did is the freezing of the political process, and when you freeze that process, you prevent the establishment of a Palestinian state, and you prevent a discussion about the refugees, the borders, and Jerusalem. Effectively, this whole package that is called the Palestinian state, with all that it entails, has been removed from our agenda indefinitely. Weissglass also said that Sharon's plan is actually formaldehyde. It supplies the amount of formaldehyde that's necessary so that there will not be a political process with the Palestinians. One might have expected Bush to be angry with Sharon and to try to keep the roadmap alive, especially since the president, according to his national security advisor, believed that it is the only course that will bring durable peace and security. But that is not what happened. In the spring of 2004, Bush publicly embraced Sharon's unilateral approach, saying that it was a bold, courageous step and that the world owed Sharon a thank you for pursuing it. Then, in a dramatic shift, on April 14, Bush reversed the stated policy of every president since Lyndon Johnson by proclaiming that Israel would not have to return virtually all of the territories that it occupied in 1967, and that Palestinian refugees would not be allowed to return to their former homes in Israel, but would have to settle in a new Palestinian state. Previously, American policy was that the Israelis and the Palestinians would negotiate these issues. These moves sparked outrage in the Middle East, but were widely seen in the United States as smart politics in a year when George Bush was up for re-election. Writing in early 2004, Thomas Friedman of the New York Times captured the essence of Bush's predicament regarding the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Mr. Sharon has the Palestinian leader Yasser Arafat under house arrest in his office in Ramallah, and he's had George Bush under house arrest in the Oval Office. Mr. Sharon has Mr. Arafat surrounded by tanks and Mr. Bush surrounded by Jewish and Christian pro-Israel lobbyists, by a Vice President, Dick Cheney, who's ready to do whatever Mr. Sharon dictates, and by political handlers telling the president not to put any pressure on Israel in an election year, all conspiring to make sure the president does nothing. During this entire period, the Israelis continued building settlements in the West Bank, despite American protests and despite the fact that the roadmap explicitly calls upon Israel to freeze all settlement activity, including natural growth of settlements. They also continued assassinating Palestinian leaders, sometimes at the most unhelpful moments, at least from a U.S. perspective. For example, the IDF scuttled a proposed Palestinian ceasefire on July 22, 2002, when it killed Sheikh Salah Shehada, a prominent Hamas leader, and 14 others, including 9 children. The White House denounced the attack as heavy-handed, but did not force Israel to end its targeted assassinations policy. As noted previously, the IDF undermined another emerging ceasefire in June 2003 when it tried but failed to kill Rantisi, another Hamas leader. On March 22, 2004, Israel assassinated Hamas leader Sheikh Ahmed Yassin with American-made Hellfire missiles. This move was generally perceived as a serious blow to America's position in the Middle East, not only because U.S. weapons were used, but also because many in the Arab world believed that the Bush administration had given Israel the green light to kill a paraplegic in a wheelchair. The Washington Post columnist Jim Hoagland wrote in the wake of that killing, "With the possible exception of Charles de Gaulle, no friendly foreign leader has complicated modern American diplomacy and strategy more consistently or gravely than Ariel Sharon. He pursues Israel's interests with a warrior's tenacity and directness that take away the breath and the options of everyone else." Less than a month later, on April 17, 2004, the IDF finally killed Rantisi.